All right, buckle up, everybody. We're going deep on freedom of speech today. But not the usual talking
No,
points.
not at all.
We're diving into this essay by Joseph Aminian.
Oh, this is a good one.
It's wild, like he somehow combined a history lesson, a personal journal, and a stand-up comedy routine all into one to really dissect what this whole right to free speech even means.
Yeah, it's fascinating how he starts things off. I mean,
Yeah.
takes the first commandment and something we all think we know and just flips the script.
Oh, yeah.
He interprets it not as like a rule from some higher power, but as a declaration about free will.
Like inherent to us.
Exactly. You have free will.
It definitely made me rethink some things. But he doesn't stop there. He connects this idea to freedom of speech, saying it's like a direct offshoot of that free will we're all supposedly born with.
And this is where his idea of the slave mindset comes in.
Okay, yeah.
And he's not talking about literal slavery here.
Right.
But more like how we end up enslaving ourselves, by always needing everyone else's approval, like living in fear of what people think.
Oh, constantly worried about judgment.
Yeah, and even like terrified of just dying.
Oh, wow. So it's like we build these invisible cages around ourselves.
Exactly. He even used the analogy of like a royal family member.
Okay.
Might have money, privilege, the whole nine yards, but their lives are so controlled, expectations, tradition, the whole bit. It's like a gilded cage.
Oh, I see. I see. So then how does this slave mindset, how does it tie back into freedom of speech?
Well, because Aminian says freedom of speech comes from that free will, it's not just a perk. It's like a basic human right. It has to be.
Right.
And he points to, the U.S. Constitution, especially that First Amendment, as proof that this link was recognized.
Okay. But he doesn't stop there. He brings up the Second Amendment too, right?
Oh, yeah.
And that's where it gets a little spicy because he claims the Second Amendment exists to protect that free speech right.
That's a bold statement for sure.
Yeah.
Really challenges how people usually see it. But think about it this way. If you truly believe that speaking your mind is like a fundamental right, then having some way to protect that right, even with force, becomes pretty crucial. You know what I mean?
Whoa, that definitely puts a whole new spin on the gun control debate.
Doesn't it? And what's interesting is how he connects all this back to personal responsibility.
Oh, right. When he quotes Robert F. Kennedy Jr. talking about Americans being in a, what was it, a spiritual war?
Yeah, spiritual war and how it's affecting their well-being.
Yes.
And Aminian uses this to say, true freedom isn't just about external rights. It's about taking ownership of our inner selves, too.
So like our state of mind.
Yes, like taking care of our physical health, our mental health. He even says digestive health is a part of it.
Wow.
All of it contributes to that inner freedom he's talking about.
So it's not just what we're allowed to say out loud, but how we live and the choices we make every day that limit or expand that freedom, huh?
Exactly. And here's where things take a turn, gets a bit more provocative. Aminian says there are outside forces, foreign entities, deliberately messing with things like our education system and the media to undermine free speech here in America.
Whoa, okay. Hold on, that's a big claim.
Yeah.
How does he support that?
Well, he points to evidence of foreign influence in big media companies, think tanks, even educational institutions. He says they're using their resources to push agendas that benefit them, often at the expense of open discussion and critical thinking.
So it's like we're being manipulated and we don't even realize it.
That's the idea, and it brings up some serious questions, right?
Yeah.
Like who benefits from limiting free speech?
Yeah.
And in this age of information overload, how do we even tell what's real anymore?
Yeah, everyone's got an angle. It's almost like we need a guidebook just to navigate this whole information war zone.
And that's where Aminian brings up, remember George Carlin?
Oh, of course, legendary.
Remember his line? America has been bought and owned a long time ago. You have owners.
Oh, yeah. Classic Carlin. But how does that relate to what we're talking about?
It fits perfectly with Aminian's call for critical thinking. He wants us to question everything we see, everything we hear, especially if it's coming from authority figures.
So instead of just absorbing information passively, we need to engage with it, question it, be skeptical, and do our own research.
Exactly. That's a skill that applies to everything, not just politics or the news.
Oh, absolutely.
It's about taking control of our own beliefs, understanding where they come from, and being open to changing our minds when new information comes along.
So how do we actually cultivate this critical thinking? Does Aminian give us any pointers?
He does. He actually shares some personal stories about how he developed that skill himself. It started way back in his childhood.
Interesting.
He talks about how his dad encouraged him to question everything,
Mm.
to read tons and to never just take things at face value.
Hmm. And there's that story about his third grade teacher. She realizes he's, ahead of the curve, and so she gives him a whole different kind of challenge.
Oh, yeah. Asked him to help his classmates learn.
Recognizing that his patience and his willingness to help others was actually a special skill.
It's a beautiful example of like true intelligence. It's not just about knowing a bunch of facts. It's about using that knowledge to actually help others. And that leads us to one of Aminian's more interesting ideas, the madness of the mystic.
Okay, the madness of the mystic. No, now I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this.
Okay. Imagine being able to stay completely silent, like on the inside, even when things are really intense, even under pressure.
Hmm.
That's the core of what he calls the madness of the mystic. It's like a mental discipline that very few people can master.
So it's like self-protection in a way, but also a way of respecting other people's boundaries.
Yeah, that's it. He emphasizes the importance of boundaries, of discretion, especially for people dealing with sensitive information. It's this ancient practice, but it's still so relevant today, especially when you think about how much pressure there is to share everything all the time.
Yeah, constant exposure.
Right. And think about what that does to us, like our mental and emotional health.
Mhm.
Maybe we all need to learn how to protect our inner space a little better.
That's a great point. It's like we're always overloaded with information, and it's hard to know what to believe, what to trust, what to keep to ourselves.
Exactly. And this leads to one of Aminian's most challenging questions. Can people empower authority figures ever admit they don't know something?
Oh, that's something you rarely ever hear, especially from people at the top.
Right. But he ties this back to his emphasis on truth and, the dangers of clinging to those comfortable illusions.
Okay.
He's asking us to be honest about what we know and what we don't know and to be wary of those who act like they have all the answers.
So it's not just about questioning authority, it's about questioning ourselves, too.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. Aminian saying recognizing what we don't know is just as important, if not more so, than what we think we know.
Wow, yeah, that's pretty deep. I'm really curious to see where he goes with this next.
Me too. But before we get into that, let's take a minute to recap what we've covered so far. We've seen how Aminian takes that first commandment, connects it to free speech, and introduces the slave mindset as this obstacle to that freedom.
We've also looked at how he argues that the Second Amendment is actually there to protect free speech, and how true freedom involves taking responsibility not just for what we say, but for our overall well-being.
We touched on his pretty bold claims about these outside forces manipulating things to undermine free speech.
Right.
And of course, the importance of developing those critical thinking skills to navigate this whole crazy landscape.
We even got into his personal experiences with learning and that madness of the mystic idea as a way to protect both information and our own mental space.
And last but not least, we've started to unpack his question about whether those in power can ever admit they just don't know something, highlighting the dangers of holding on to those comforting illusions and the need to be honest about our own limitations.
Wow. Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground already. I'm really excited to see where this deep dive takes us next.
And now we get to, I think, like the core of it all, the heart of Aminian's argument. He says that facing our own mortality, really confronting it head on, that's the key to truly getting life.
I gotta admit, that's a pretty heavy concept to like really grasp. I think I get what he's saying, right? It's like by accepting that we have limits, that we're human, that's actually what frees us on a deeper level.
Yeah, it's a total paradox, but it makes sense. When we stop trying to pretend we're not going to die,
Right.
when we just embrace it as like part of being human, it frees us from that fear, the anxiety that comes with clinging to the illusion that we're going to live forever.
So it's like by acknowledging that our time is limited, we can start to appreciate it more and make better, more conscious choices about how we live our lives.
Exactly. And he doesn't just, drop these bombshells and leave us hanging. Aminian gives us like a roadmap for actually putting this stuff into practice.
Okay, yeah, I'm all ears. What's on this roadmap?
Well, he talks about cultivating inner freedom through things like, critical thinking, being skeptical of authority, and even like embracing silence.
Those are powerful tools, especially when you consider how much like noise and distraction we're dealing with every single day.
Right. And he also emphasizes taking responsibility for our well-being, mind and body.
It's interesting how he links those two things. Usually freedom's all about like our rights and liberties, but
Yeah.
he brings in this whole other layer of personal responsibility, taking care of ourselves.
Yeah, and he even gets into specifics like learning open source intelligence techniques.
Hold up. Open source intelligence. That sounds like something James Bond would do.
I know, right? But what he means is we can become our own investigators, dig deeper, find the truth ourselves, rather than just believing what we're told.
Don't just take it at face value. Go find the evidence.
Exactly. With all the misinformation and propaganda out there, Aminian's saying we can't afford to be passive anymore. We got to be active, think critically, challenge the status quo, and dig for that truth ourselves.
Makes sense, especially these days when you're getting hit with information from like a million different directions. But how do we know where to even start?
Well, one of the things that makes Aminian's writing so powerful is his honesty. He doesn't shy away from, tough, uncomfortable truths. It's like he leans into them.
He's definitely not afraid to get real, that's for sure. Embraces it, even.
Exactly. He's willing to be vulnerable, to admit his own, shortcomings, his uncertainties. And that makes his insights that much stronger.
That's something I really appreciate about his writing. He talks about his own experiences with disillusionment, with facing his own mortality, even like times when he's struggled to understand why people do the things they do. It's just raw and honest in a way you don't see very often.
Yeah, especially not in academic writing. It makes you realize he's just like us, grappling with these big questions.
Yeah.
And that makes him relatable, even when he's saying stuff that some people might find, a little controversial.
And his style is so conversational. It makes even these complex ideas like easier to grasp.
It's so refreshing. He's not afraid to use humor, tell personal stories, even poke fun at himself a little to get his point across.
I love when he calls himself, what was it? A primate animal who's aware of his own ignorance. It's funny, but it also makes you stop and think, right, about our place in the universe, all that.
Yeah, he's great at using those moments to kind of wake us up, and make us think differently. He's not trying to hand us the answers. He's trying to spark that curiosity, that journey of self-discovery.
And that's where he brings back the madness of the mystic again, right?
Yes. It keeps coming back because it's such a powerful metaphor for self-control,
Yeah.
especially in this world where we're always tempted to overshare and look for validation from others.
It's like a reminder that true strength comes from within, from mastering our own minds, our emotions.
And he shares these wild stories about how he's maintained this silence throughout his life, even with people he's closest to. The level of discipline is just incredible.
And he makes such a strong case for why this practice is still so important today, especially with information being so easily shared and, twisted.
It's about protecting ourselves, our mental and emotional well-being. But it's also about protecting sensitive information that could have real consequences if it got into the wrong hands.
He even says that even under like truth serum or something, he would never reveal anything that could put himself or others at risk.
Yeah, it's like he embodies this ancient wisdom of keeping secrets, something that's been passed down for generations. It's really fascinating.
So how does this idea of protecting information tie into, the bigger picture of freedom of speech?
Well, Aminian says that true freedom of speech needs balance. It's not just about being able to say whatever we want, whenever we want. It's about recognizing that sometimes silence is necessary to protect ourselves and others.
So again, freedom comes with responsibility.
Exactly. And this leads to another one of Aminian's criticisms, the danger of what he calls the God complex.
The God complex. What's he talking about there?
It's this tendency, especially for people in power, to believe they can control everything, even like the laws of nature. And that arrogance, he says, is incredibly dangerous, especially when you think about things like nuclear weapons.
That's a scary thought. Like, the more power someone has, the more likely they are to lose touch with reality.
Exactly. He's highlighting the dangers of unchecked power and how vital humility is.
Which is something you don't see a lot of, especially from people at the top.
It's rare. But Aminian says it's absolutely essential if we want to avoid, disaster. He points out it's the scientists, the engineers who create these weapons of mass destruction, not everyday people. He even suggests that those with the most intelligence, the most expertise, might be the most susceptible to this delusion of control.
So what's the antidote? How do we fight this God complex?
Aminian's answer is simple but radical. We need those in power, those calling the shots, to just admit their limitations, to say, I don't know.
That's a lot to ask, especially in a world where admitting weakness is like the ultimate failure.
I know, but Minion says it's crucial if we want a world that's fair, that's just. He thinks that embracing uncertainty, acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, that's how we create a society that's more humble, more compassionate.
That's a beautiful idea. But how do we actually make that happen?
It starts with each of us. Minion's calling for a complete shift in perspective. He wants us to question everything except our limits and take responsibility for our own freedom. And he's not just talking the talk. He's blended history, philosophy, personal stories, even some dark humor to create something that's truly thought-provoking.
Yeah, it's a dense read for sure, but it sticks with you.
Totally agree. It's challenging, insightful, and ultimately hopeful. Minion believes we can make a better future, but it takes honesty, courage, and a willingness to let go of the illusions that are holding us back.
Yeah, it's like he's not telling you what to think. He's just like opening a door and saying, "Hey, come look at this with me."
Yeah, and he's really open about why he writes. He even says that it's how he processes his own experiences and tries to make sense of things. He's not claiming to have all the answers. He's just like inviting you along for the ride.
He's very upfront about needing to understand, needing to make sense of the things that that make him uncomfortable. It's almost like writing is how he grapples with those big, life questions.
And that honesty makes him even more relatable, even when he's saying stuff that some people might disagree with.
One thing that really stuck with me was his discussion of education. You know, how his dad encouraged him to question everything, to read a lot, to form his own
It's
opinions.
so different from the way most of us learned in school, right? Just memorizing facts. Armenians pushing for a much more active way of learning, one that's driven by curiosity, a real desire to find the truth. It's about learning how to think, not just what to think.
And he tells this funny story about how he figured out multiplication on like the first day of class.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
But he had to sit through months of repetition because his classmates were learning at a slower pace.
And his teacher realized that, he was way ahead. So she gave him a totally different task to help his classmates learn.
It's such a good example of what real mentorship is, right? It's not about showing off, it's about empowering others to reach their potential.
And it goes back to Aminian's emphasis on community, on, the idea that we're all in this together. He's not just talking about individual freedom. He's calling for a collective awakening,
But
a shift in how we think that benefits everyone.
now, one last thing that I kept thinking about was his idea of the Garden of Eden. He says his ancestors, the naturalists, they saw paradise not as some far-off heavenly place, but as a real physical space.
Right, he talks about those orchards, these enclosed gardens, as these places of peace and abundance where people lived in harmony with nature.
Yeah, it's a beautiful image.
It is.
And he suggests that this ancient wisdom is still relevant today. It reminds us that we don't have to wait for some afterlife to experience paradise. We can create it here, now, by connecting more deeply with ourselves, with each other, and with the natural world.
It's a hopeful message, a good way to end this deep dive into Arminian's work. He's challenged us to face some hard truths, to accept our limits, and ultimately to understand what it really means to be free.
So if you're feeling what Aminian's saying, here's the question he leaves us with. What does confronting your own mortality mean for you? How could accepting your limitations actually unlock more freedom in your life? It's something to think about as you keep exploring these ideas because this deep dive, it's just the beginning of your journey.